So welcome back to oldhalloween.com, and just a quick reminder, you can always go and check out our resources on www.oldhalloween.com. Today, we're going to talk about the curious case of Tommy Whiskers. I'm sure some of you already think of Tommy Whiskers as like the Deco cat, the Art Deco cat. Some of you might use Tommy Whiskers, but we're going to talk about the curious case of Tommy Whiskers here in just a little bit. I want to also come back to what I promised last time around, which is that we would also talk about this little guy, because I'm still not quite sure where he came from. I just found him in an old scrapbook. Actually, it was a 1912 scrapbook, but there was some 1940s material laid into it. That's where I found that cat. And we'll compare him to some of his more modern, if you could call these antique cats, or candy containers. We'll compare size-wise and style-wise. That should be kind of fun. And of course, we'll get to Tommy Whiskers. But before we do any of those things, I want to take just a moment and talk about oldhalloween.com's resources. If you haven't yet discovered it, I encourage you to navigate over to www.oldhalloween.com and check out the catalogs. So if you navigate to oldhalloween.com, and you can see it right here, holy cow, I had no idea that this little celluloid witch sold for about $3,000 in February of 2022. But we do all kinds of things that are really kind of cool like that. We bookmark things we spot, historical record, hammer prices, all kinds of things. You can also go and find in our resources drop-down a number of things like our price guides. We also have catalogs. And if you click on catalogs, you'll see we've got a couple that are really super interesting. We've got some very, very early ones in our catalog collection. We have some ones that are a little bit later. So for instance, we have some 1930s and 40s catalogs. We even have some 1950s catalogs. And today, when we talk about our Tommy Whiskers, we're actually going to spend some time looking at our 1940s and 50s catalogs. Actually, scratch that, because Tommy Whiskers is not that new. So what we're going to do is go further back and go to the 1916 through 1930s catalogs, which will start something like this. But before we do that, let's talk about what we mentioned last time, which is I found a thing and I can't figure it out. Let's see if you can help me figure it out. All right, it's this guy. So this little candy container is tiny, tiny, tiny. And when I say tiny, I'm talking relatively speaking, comparing this little tiny black cat with his fantastic Halloween cone hat on, pulling a cart, in this case, a cart that looks very much like a tomato. This is a Halloween candy nut cup. I know that because I have some of the other black cat candy nut cups, or candy containers, if that's what you want to call them. They're bigger, right? So these look a lot more like the witch candy cups, or there's if you probably know this, there's a particular group that they sort of look a little bit more cartoony. There's one with a witch, actually a couple with a witch. There's one with an owl and I believe a black cat. I'll have to pull mine out of storage. And in any event, they're about this size, and it's a significantly sized candy container, and they're dolly style. You can see that they are clearly designed like the Fibro dolly style from that company's their lanterns, but it folds into a candy container. And you can see you've got, of course, the black cat. He's all happy. He's pulling this sort of fruit style cart, and you can see that he's pulling it because he's holding the essentially the handles, or the parts that actually come out from the carriage. And the carriage is comprised of a fruit, and of course it has a wheel. Now there's a version of this, I didn't bring it down with me today, I just grabbed this guy. Same sized, different colors, still looks like fruit, but there's actually a wheel that has been added, and the wheel actually turns. That's very, very cool. And you can see when I say that they remind me of one another, look at this. So most of them are about this size, but this guy I just found is this sized, and it's much, much smaller. And in addition, there are some features that are also different. Now, here's what's super interesting. These have been attributed to what I believe are a later date, and I want to mention what I mean by that. So if you were to go look at a guide, you'd find that these have a very specific date. And the dates on the candy containers that are the black cats with the party hat pulling the container are considered 1950s, so they were produced in the 1950s. There are actually a number of these sort of Fibro style candy containers or nut cups that were produced in those years. And as you can see, they're actually quite large. And I'm going to give you the difference between these, the ones I'm comparing the small one to, and then the actual small one that we're going to talk about next, and the size differences. So we'll say 7 long, 4 1/4 tall, and as you can see here, about 2.5 inches wide. So that's a fairly sizable little nut cup, whereas the piece that we're comparing it to looks to be about 1/4. Put it in front here so you can see, about 1/4 of the size. So very, very, very small, and also not in the guides. So since not in the guides, makes me wonder where it came from. And I'll tell you, I've been digging around, and perhaps we should call this episode The Curious Case of Party Kitties, because, you know, party kitties. Especially cart-pulling party kitties, because that's actually a hard thing to say. Cart-pulling party kitties. Cart-pulling party kitties. Maybe I should have just named the episode that. But as you can see, much smaller, but also not in the guide. So because not in the guides made me think, well, maybe these are incredibly rare. And I will tell you that there has been one collector who has actually had these before, who reached out and said that these are incredibly rare, that these may very well have been produced earlier. Okay, so I know I found this in a scrap album that has hand dates of 1912 through 1914 in it, but tucked into the scrapbook, in addition to all of the interesting early first 2 decades of the 20th century, the last century, that had some really cool early Halloween, there was tucked into the scrapbook some handwritten letters and things, and this piece. And those letters had 1940 on them. So it seems as if the same family, or perhaps the owner, had some later material, and she, because the owner was a she, tucked that into the scrapbook along with this piece. All right, so 1940s? 1940s on this guy. I'm not going to fold him up because he is spectacular just the way he, or perhaps she, is. But I will point up a couple of things that are very, very interesting about this particular design. So I'm going to hold this one up. Now, this is one of 2, as I mentioned, that you can find in the guides. But you will notice that on this party kitty that the handles do not extend all the way back into the body of what I'm going to call the tomato, and has the wheel printed. So just like the one I'm holding up, this earlier version also has the wheel printed. That is, it does not have an articulating wheel, but rather the wheel is printed. But unlike the one over here, you'll notice that this guy's handle actually is printed and shows all the way down to almost the wheel. Likewise, you see what else is missing? Something else is missing, right? You'll notice that on the 1950s larger nut cups, there's a window on the fruit carriage, whereas there is no window on this fruit carriage. And so it seems like the earlier party kitty, cart-pulling party kitty, that he was pulling just a whole tomato. I don't know if the idea was that you would get a whole tomato and like nothing was living inside of it or what, but clearly this seems like an earlier version, a 1940s version of the 1950s nut cups or candy cups. In fact, I would even argue that this is more like a nut cup, which is oftentimes very, very small, smaller than a candy cup, because candy containers were larger by the 1950s. Most likely this was designed for nut cupping, or whatever you do with nut cups. I guess put nuts in them and eat nuts out of them. But there it is. I believe I've done my very, very best. I cannot find it in guides. I cannot find it in our catalogs. And we have hundreds of pages of catalogs at oldhalloween.com. Just go to the resources and click on catalogs and you'll find them. Can't find them in the catalogs. And we're still obviously uncovering more catalogs. We'll get more of those published. And I have some announcements on that front in the very near future. But hearing from others who have actually had this exact nut cup or candy cup before with the cart-pulling party kitty makes me think there's a good chance he's 1940s. And of course, he was found with 1940s letters inside of his scrapbook. So I'm going to go with 1940s on this guy. Okay, well, now let's talk about the curious case of Tommy Whiskers. I went ahead and went and got this is one of my rough Tommy Whiskers or Art Deco cat lanterns, and I thought I'd just bring them up. So you've seen, most likely you've seen, if not the entire lantern, you have seen maybe the front of the lantern before. So you know what we're talking about when we say Tommy Whiskers or deco lantern. This is what we're talking about. You can see this one's rough. Clearly he's been in some fights perhaps. He doesn't have his top cardboard piece here. This is the rare version because he has sort of the honeycomb on the sides. There is a version that doesn't have the honeycomb where it's sort of a flat crepe, and there's a third version that's supposedly less scarce or less rare. That's just the black cardboard on the sides. But again, you've seen these guys before. At least you've seen the front of them. I love Tommy Whiskers. I don't know if you can tell that or not, but I truly do. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to tell you the reason why we call him Tommy Whiskers, or what we call him Art Deco cat. Well, actually, I don't know the reason why we call him Art Deco cat, except he looks sort of deco. He has a visage or of a particular look to him that looks very much like we would have seen art-wise in the deco era. But he was actually marketed B2B or wholesale to retailers as Tommy Whiskers. Whether or not the retailers all call him Tommy Whiskers is another thing, maybe for another discussion. And I encourage anyone, if you have additional information that you've come across, published or otherwise, feel free to hit reply and let us know about it. But Tommy Whiskers, and I want to show you a good example in our catalog collection of Tommy Whiskers to give you a sense of what we're talking about. Okay, so here's what I did. I went into oldhalloween.com, resources, went to the price guides. I selected the price guides that was, or is listed as 1916 to, I think 1939. And I navigated to page 46. So it's a little bit later in that particular guide. You'll see down here on the left-hand side. Yeah, there it is. There's Tommy Whiskers. It says Tommy Whiskers lanterns. Let me move my glasses so I can read it. It says, a new lively-faced cat lantern printed on cardboard, die-cut with illuminated eyes, nose, and mouth, meshed tissue sides, candle holder and bottom, tissue liners. It says the size is 11 by 11 1/4 inches. And back in the day, they actually sold them by the dozen. So again, this was a wholesaler catalog. This is from Continental out of Wisconsin. Now, some folks will say that it wasn't just for retailers, that it was for anybody, but it looks like the way they tended to talk about their products, that oftentimes these were sent out so that smaller mom and pop shops could buy from them. But there it is. Tommy Whiskers lanterns. And so if you're wondering about where the name Tommy Whiskers comes from, we can find it as early as this 1939 catalog. And my guess is we could probably find it in other catalogs if we had copies of them as well. Oh yeah, and one last thing. It's interesting. Part of the curious case of Tommy Whiskers is these catalogs sometimes listed Tommy Whiskers as 11 by 11 1/4, but our contemporary guides will say 11 1/4 by 11 1/4. So we have to wonder where the extra 1/4 inch came from. My guess is that there's some variance in terms of how these things were created, die cut out, and then constructed into lanterns. But yeah, I like them. Absolutely love them. So that is the curious case of Tommy Whiskers. If you ever want to drop knowledge on a friend who collects lanterns and the person says, I've never seen the lantern before, or that's a unique lantern, I've seen a few of those, and refers to it as a deco lantern, feel free to say, yeah, I love Tommy Whisker lanterns. Or I'm always kind of interested in looking at Tommy Whiskers lanterns. My guess is when you say or use the phrase Tommy Whiskers, they'll give you kind of a look back because it's not common parlance these days. It's a relatively confined piece of language to the old B2B or wholesaler catalogs. Now, some of the guides will sometimes refer to the wholesaler guides language of Tommy Whiskers, which is fantastic. I just wanted to make sure that you knew it's the same thing as the Art Deco cat. Right, now, we've talked about the mystery of the smaller nut cup cat. That is the, what would we call it? We called it the cart pulling party cat. We've talked about Tommy Whiskers. I want to mention one other thing. Coming soon to our catalog resource, have a nice little 1929 Denison inventory. So this is a Denison goods for Halloween. Check that out. Isn't that fantastic? So we'll get that scanned and get that up. Once it's scanned and up, anyone can look at it. I encourage you to look at it. And of course, as we add additional catalogs or price guide information, we'll make sure to let you know. A couple of quick notes before I jump off here, and that is to remind you that we also have some price guides. So we already have price guides up for pulp jack-o'-lanterns or pulp lanterns. We have price guides up for paper and composition lanterns. You want to check those out. We also have a price guide up for crepe aprons. We have a price guide up for the early Halloween doorstops, and some of those are phenomenal. In fact, a really interesting kind of fun fact is the most expensive Halloween collectible I have ever been able to find sell was a Halloween doorstop. That's interesting stuff. And then finally, we already have started a die cut price guide. We already have more than 100 different die cuts on it, but of course there are many more than 100 die cuts, and so we are adding those as we can get to them. And if you're wondering how in the world our price guides come together, we don't just reach out of the backside and pull them out, but rather we actually look at a number of trending hammer prices. So we use a couple of different tools. We compare prices, recently realized prices, not eBay listed prices, but actual prices of what things have sold for at auction. And we also do, in some cases, trend analysis. So if there's more than just a single point, because a single point's not a trend, we look at what that trend happens to look like, and then we include that in our price guide. So check out our price guides, check out our catalogs, and of course, you want to come back and check out our YouTube channel, because we'll continually be putting out content. And finally, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter, because once a month we do send out a newsletter that includes all the things that are upcoming and additional and new resources. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoy your upcoming months of collecting. For oldhalloween.com, I am Kurt Gilstrap.